Right away. Just before we let too much of your talk go out of our mind, James, do you think that carbon neutrality, that sustainability purpose, is that going to pay a premium for your product?
I think it has to. We've got to find a way to make it happen. I mean, ultimately, I'd like to get to a point where we can realise a premium for it, and we can then start to send pricing signals down the supply chain to our suppliers and eventually to farmers to provide an incentive for carbon-aware farming to take place and maybe some changes of on-farm practices. But we're going to find out, is the short answer. I'm not sure. I'm betting that we will be able to get a premium for it, but we will see.
Is that a nice project to hear about, Tess, when you think about when we've been speaking about the beef industry as a whole being carbon neutral by 2030? And I suppose just picking up from what James has been talking about, how obtainable do you think that goal is for industry?
Look, I'm not sure about the target, but you must have targets. We may fall short, but I honestly believe it's better off having a target than none. We may get there, and there are a number of pathways to get to carbon neutrality by 2030, and industry is exploring all of them at the moment through R&D. If it reaches the stage where it's at marketing, I would see that as success.
Hi, Andrew Whitelaw from Macaro. My question was to Tess. One of your slides was quite interesting. It said that I think 48% would possibly pay for sustainable meat. Is that statistics from Australian consumers? And if it is, do you have similar statistics for our consumers overseas? Because the bulk of our red meat does go to overseas markets. So what is the willingness to pay for sustainably produced beef in Indonesia, China, etc.?
So the sources for that one are Australian. That's Roy Morgan. It's an annual figure, so that was March 2016, that figure as well. I don't have export market figures for you, but this push is coming from both export and domestic markets. So in the room on our consultative framework, we have the major supermarkets in there, and they certainly have sustainability on their radar. They're auditing for it now. But we also are feeling this in our export markets. Our major export markets are all signalling that environmental stewardship of some level could potentially even be part of free trade agreements.
And next question up there. Yeah.
I guess this one's for Tess and James Matter mainly. When you talk about carbon neutrality, especially in the beef industry, are you also talking about sort of climate change equivalent emissions of sort of methane as well?
Yes. That's the short answer. Long answer is very complicated. But in the studies that we use to basically measure a footprint on the meat product that we sell, they took into account the entire life cycle emissions of that production method. So we looked at, a lot of what we sell is grass-fed beef from Southern Australia. So we looked at studies that have been done around the farming of grass-fed beef in Southern Australia and the carbon footprint of that, and it did take into account methane production as well.
We got another question at the back there.
Charles Nason, Farmer, Queensland. A series of comments and questions, James. The first one is I think the traditional marketing says you ask the consumer what they want and you provide it. Steve Jobs turned that on his head. He believed the world needed the iPhone, and now we can't live without it. Also, interesting how times have changed. We would have commissioned a survey on wheat probably 20 years ago, southern Queensland. The results were that the consumers were quite happy to pay for benefits to themselves but not to the environment. There was a few said they would, but the vast majority didn't. So we were going down an EMS process. We showed that was the end of it. David, my understanding of the world's grasslands, most evolved under fire, not under animals. Most of them didn't have animals. So you're almost saying that they've evolved with animals. You might answer to that. Tess, question to you. We concentrating on incorporating carbon into trees, which detracts from productivity. Surely we should be focusing on putting carbon into soils, which adds to productivity. David might comment on that also.
There we go. All right, let's work our way down the line there. Who would like to go first in response? Yeah, I'll have a go. Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, look, I think certainly fire was part of the ecosystems in those temperate grasslands, but all the big grasslands in Africa that had millions and millions of animals grazing them all the time, they definitely evolved in the presence of grazing animals. So I think fire was part of it, but definitely animals were part of it.
Look, the whole piece around carbon neutral by 2030, as I said, there are a number of pathways to that. So feed additives are one, tree planting is just one. So your question about planting trees, but renewal of carbon into soil is another one. And I can't help myself, I'm going to put my feedlot hat back on. Putting grain-fed beef actually has lower emissions than grass-fed. That's simply because we can get cattle to market quicker. So there needs to also be a recognition of the part that feedlots can play in the supply chain, and I'm just putting it out there.
We'll keep moving because we're nearly done. Mick, would you like your question?
Yeah, Mike Foley from the Land newspaper. I've got, a quick double bunger. How much do you think it would cost to fund the federal government to fund a fully functioning ecosystems services fund, some sort of NRM fund that actually delivers at the farm gate for producers? I'll note that the PM recent climate fund didn't include any ecosystem services payments. And just quickly, you may not be able to answer, but James, you mentioned the California example with fire and the ecosystem services payments there seems to be ultimately underwritten by public utilities funding through. What future mix could you see for private and public funding? How much private funding could underwrite such schemes?
So, two questions. Look, there's been an idea floating around for a little while around, and if you think about the energy sector and the amazing growth we've seen in the renewables and energy efficiency technology, a large amount of that has happened because we've had the CEFC and ARENA working together to both drive innovation through ARENA, but also drive the investment models that support and de-risk early stage investment. Now, it has been discussed, do we need a similar vehicle in the agribusiness sector to create these mechanisms and build the infrastructure around, particularly around the monitoring and reporting and the frameworks to communicate that the land is well managed. But, that's for the politicians to play with. In terms of what scale, I think we need to get started. So something that was big enough for the investor market to get moving, and probably similar to the CEFC. But on the who pays, in the overseas example, there's a very clear role for the public sector to underpin those types of investment sectors. But I guess that the innovation is really the ability to bring entities that don't talk to each other, who are very siloed in their thinking. I'm just in charge of water. I'm only interested in water. If you're only interested in water, then an ecosystem services project will never get up. But if you're interested in the water and the carbon and etc., then and you're able to, I guess, get those different entities to commit, then that can happen. And there's no reason why that can't be a mix of private and public sectors working together.
Have you done much work around what that would be in terms of, are we talking billions here or?
Well, these and this is the trouble for this market, is that the solutions are very bespoke. And I suppose if we look around the country, you can see the components that might exist and that could be built out. So, I was really excited, for example, when Port of Brisbane paid farmers in the catchment to mitigate erosion, because that actually saves Port of Brisbane money. So one of their major costs is removing sediment from the Brisbane River, and if you can keep it on farm, then that's a great win-win. Now, also within that catchment, you've got water utilities who have demonstrated that they're willing to pay on a small scale farmers to manage nutrients on their farms, but they're small at the moment. So the challenge is, can we have a big picture framework for the entire catchment and look at, okay, what are the activities that could be undertaken within that landscape, and you know, who would the beneficiaries be, and how might we pay for them?
Now, I am a student of the ABC, which means I have a million more questions, but not enough time to ask any of them, and I feel like the news is on the way and I have to finish things now. But ladies and gentlemen, it has been really interesting to not only hear about some of the economic side of it, also taking the economics out of it at the farm level and just managing it in the right way with David Marsh as well, in through the beef industry with Tess Herbert, and also finishing with James Madden and talking about a culture change through a business and what that means at that level when you're trying to manage it there. So please thank all of our guests today and what they've said and their thoughts that they've offered. And that'll wrap it up. I think it's now officially break time at 3:30. Thank you very much for joining us in here this afternoon.